The tone below follows your requested style. First-person narration, uneasy atmosphere, no supernatural confirmation, slow burn tension, and an abrupt cut before revealing too much. On the 7th day after Maria McCloy was buried, the old woman living across the narrow street from Maria's house was said to have seen the kitchen light turn on for less than 10 seconds just before midnight, then disappear again without a sound. And maybe under different circumstances nobody would have cared, because the city itself was still moving the same way it always had. Buses still passed the corner store every morning. Children still kicked flattened plastic bottles beside the broken sidewalk. And somewhere 2 blocks away, a man selling roasted corn kept shouting prices loud enough to echo between the apartments. But people had already started avoiding the side of the street where Maria used to live, not because anyone claimed something supernatural had happened, but because there was this uncomfortable feeling that the house looked too alive for a place that had supposedly been empty for days. I remember standing outside the gate myself that afternoon after the funeral flowers had already started turning brown under the heat. And what disturbed me the most was not the silence. It was the tiny ordinary sounds that should not have still been there. A chair scraping lightly against the kitchen floor sometime after sunset. The slow spinning ceiling fan inside the back room, even though the electricity in that section of the house was believed to have been disconnected. And according to one neighbor who later refused to repeat the story publicly, there was, supposedly, a very soft radio signal playing sometime around dawn. The kind of old station Maria used to listen to while cleaning dishes alone. Low enough that you could almost mistake it for someone whispering behind a wall. I told myself there had to be simple explanations. Maybe somebody forgot to unplug something. Maybe a relative still had keys. Maybe grief itself was making people hear things that were never there. But then small details kept piling up in ways that became harder to ignore. The curtains near the kitchen window moving slightly, despite the air outside being completely still. Muddy footprints near the side entrance that disappeared halfway across the concrete path. A drinking glass left beside the sink, although everyone close to Maria insisted the house had been locked immediately after the burial. And what unsettled me most was the smell. Because every evening near sunset, there was reportedly a faint scent of burnt cloves drifting from the back of the property. The same smell Maria carried on her clothes during the final months before her death. Some people in the neighborhood began creating stories on their own. Others avoided even saying her name out loud. But nobody truly knew anything. Not yet. And for almost an entire week, her sister stayed completely silent. She attended the funeral, wearing dark glasses despite the cloudy weather. She thanked visitors politely, accepted food she never touched, and sat through prayers without once breaking down in front of anyone, which many people quietly noticed. Because Maria's sister had always been known as the emotional one in the family, the one who cried during weddings, during church songs, even during old movies. Yet after the burial, she behaved almost too calmly, as if she had spent years preparing herself for something the rest of us still did not understand. Then, on the 7th night, just after several relatives reportedly left the house, Maria's sister finally stepped outside onto the narrow porch while the television inside continued playing to an empty room. And when one of the older women asked whether she was all right, she didn't answer immediately. She only stared toward the dark kitchen window for several seconds before quietly saying something that made the entire conversation stop. There are things Maria kept hidden for many years. After her sister said those words, nobody in the room asked another question right away. And maybe that was because most of us still preferred remembering Maria McCloy the way she used to be before everything slowly became difficult to explain. Before the strange habits. Before the unfinished conversations. Before people started lowering their voices whenever her name appeared in discussion. Because there was once a version of Maria that seemed almost impossible to imagine disappearing. The kind of woman who made ordinary places feel warmer without even trying. I still remember the long cream-colored scarf she carried almost everywhere, even during weather that wasn't cold enough to need it. She used to fold it carefully over the back of a dining chair instead of throwing it aside like most people would. And after her death, according to her sister, the scarf was still hanging exactly where Maria left it days earlier, untouched, as if someone expected her to come back for it before evening. There was also that pair of dark shoes near the front hallway that she reportedly stopped wearing during the last months of her life. Nobody knew why, because, from the outside, they looked perfectly fine. But her sister later claimed Maria once stood staring at those shoes for nearly an entire minute before quietly placing them back in the closet and locking the door again. And that was another thing people began remembering afterward: the locks. Maria had apparently developed the habit of checking the front door twice before going to bed, then returning several minutes later to check it again without saying a word. At first everyone laughed gently about it, saying maybe she was becoming forgetful, maybe stress had caught up with her, maybe too many late nights had exhausted her mind. But slowly, the routine became impossible not to notice. Because even during conversations, she would suddenly stop speaking halfway through a sentence just to glance toward the entrance of the house, like she thought somebody might already be standing there, waiting quietly on the other side. And yet during the day, she still looked almost completely normal to outsiders, smiling in photographs, greeting neighbors, sitting beside windows with a half-finished cup of tea cooling near her elbow, while music played softly from another room. One of the last times I saw her, she was writing something inside a small notebook with faded blue corners. Not a diary exactly, more like scattered reminders. Grocery lists mixed with strange, unfinished thoughts. Her sister later claimed many pages had been torn out after Maria died, though nobody seems certain who removed them. And maybe what unsettled me most was hearing how ordinary some of those final moments truly were. Because, according to people close to her, there were no dramatic confessions, no screaming arguments, no obvious signs that everything underneath her carefully arranged life had already begun cracking apart. Instead, it was smaller things, quieter things. Maria reportedly started sleeping with the kitchen light still on, something she had never done before because she used to complain that even tiny lights kept her awake. She began avoiding certain rooms in the house after sunset, without clearly explaining why. And on several occasions her sister said Maria asked her to stay on the phone late into the night, even when neither of them had anything important left to say. Just silence breathing between sentences, interrupted occasionally by Maria whispering, "Wait," before drifting away from the conversation for several seconds at a time, as though she were listening to another sound somewhere deeper inside the house. And then there were the windows, according to her sister. Maria developed the strange habit of standing beside the living room curtains long after midnight, not fully opening them, just touching the fabric lightly, while staring through the narrow space toward the empty street outside. Sometimes for so long that the tea beside her would turn completely cold. And whenever someone asked what she was looking at, Maria would reportedly smile in a way that made the question feel unwelcome, before changing the subject entirely. then ending the call much earlier than usual. Several days after the funeral, when relatives had already stopped visiting as often and the flowers near the gate had started collapsing under the heat, Maria's sister finally agreed to describe what she claimed was the last real conversation she ever had with Maria McCloy. Not the short calls about groceries or family errands, but the final conversation that now reportedly keeps replaying in her mind every night without warning. And what made the story unsettling was not anything dramatic. Maria supposedly said it was how strangely ordinary everything sounded at first. According to her sister, the call happened late in the evening while a television murmured somewhere in the background of Maria's house. One of those old programs she apparently never paid full attention to. Dishes could be heard lightly touching in the kitchen. A spoon falling against the floor once. Then silence. Then Maria laughing softly about something neither of them could later remember clearly. And for several minutes, the conversation moved the way ordinary conversations always do, between two people who have spoken for decades. Small complaints, half-finished stories, reminders about medicine, questions repeated because one person wasn't listening carefully enough. But then, according to her sister, something shifted in a way she still cannot properly explain, because Maria suddenly stopped responding in the middle of a sentence. Not abruptly. Not like the call disconnected. Just silence. Long. Enough that her sister reportedly pulled the phone away from her ear to check whether the line had frozen. Later she estimated the silence lasted maybe 14 seconds, though she admitted she could be wrong. But what she insists she remembers clearly was the faint sound of Maria breathing. Very quietly. As if she had moved away from the phone to listen to something happening elsewhere inside the house. And when Maria finally spoke again, her voice allegedly sounded distracted. Thinner, somehow. She asked her sister whether dogs had been barking outside her own home too, which felt like a strange question because the sound of dogs could indeed be heard faintly through Maria's side of the phone call at that exact moment. Several sharp barks somewhere beyond the yard. Then the metallic slam of what sounded like a gate or old iron door closing hard against concrete. After that, according to the story, the television inside Maria's house reportedly lost signal for a few seconds, the familiar static crackling loudly enough for her sister to notice even through the phone speaker. Maria apologized immediately afterward and claimed the weather was affecting reception, though according to neighbors interviewed later, the weather that night had supposedly been completely calm. And what disturbed her sister most was not the silence itself, but the repetition. Because Maria apparently began asking the same question again and again in slightly different ways. Did I tell you someone came earlier? Then, several minutes later, did I mention somebody stopped by today? And later once more, quieter this time. Do you remember if I said someone visited? Her sister reportedly answered each time thinking Maria was simply exhausted or distracted, but looking back now, she believes Maria was trying to say something without fully saying it, like somebody struggling to approach a subject they no longer felt safe speaking about directly. Then another silence came, shorter, this time, followed by the sound of movement near what her sister assumed was the kitchen area. Something lightly dragged across the floor. Maybe a chair. Maybe nothing unusual at all. And, according to her sister, Maria suddenly lowered her voice almost to a whisper and asked whether metal doors always sounded louder at night. After hearing that, her sister claimed she laughed nervously and told Maria she needed proper sleep, that stress was making her overthink ordinary sounds, And, for a few seconds, Maria reportedly laughed too. But it was brief, forced, disappearing almost immediately. Before the call ended, Maria asked one final question that her sister now refuses to repeat publicly. Not because it was shocking, but because she says the tone of Maria's voice frightened her more than the words themselves. And when people later asked why she never went to check on her sister that night, Maria's sister only stared down at her hands for a long moment before quietly saying, "At the time, I thought she was only tired, but now I finally understand." A few days after that final phone call was described publicly, Maria's sister reportedly returned to the house for the first time without relatives surrounding her. No prayers, no visitors carrying food containers, no voices trying to fill the silence with sympathy, just the slow sound of keys touching against each other while she stood in front of the same front door Maria McCloy used to lock twice every night before bed. And according to her later account, the strangest part was how normal everything inside still looked at first glance. The living room remained tidy. Dishes had already been cleaned. Curtains half open exactly the way Maria preferred during the afternoon. Yet the longer she stayed inside the house, the more she reportedly began noticing tiny things that felt wrong in ways she could not easily explain. Not dangerous, not dramatic, just deeply unsettling. Like walking through a place where somebody had quietly interrupted their own life halfway through living it. Near the kitchen wall, there was an old paper calendar Maria supposedly used more out of habit than necessity. She circled dates constantly with dark blue ink. Birthdays, errands, television programs she did not want to miss. But according to her sister, several days near the end of the month had been circled repeatedly over one another until the paper almost tore. The same date marked again and again with increasing pressure. No explanation beside it. No appointment written nearby. Just thick, overlapping circles that looked less like reminders and more like someone trying desperately not to forget something important. And seeing that apparently brought back a memory her sister had almost dismissed months earlier. Maria sitting at the kitchen table very late at night, staring at that same calendar while absent-mindedly stirring cold tea long after midnight. When asked what she was looking for, Maria reportedly answered, "I'm trying to make sure I remember which day feels different," then laughed softly afterward, as if embarrassed by her own words. At the time, nobody thought much about it. But inside that empty house, the sentence reportedly sounded different in hindsight. Then there were the torn notes, small pieces of paper discovered beside the bedroom trash bin, grocery lists ripped in half, unfinished sentences cut away before the ends could be read. According to her sister, one fragment only contained the words, "Don't leave the," before the rest disappeared under a jagged tear. Another note reportedly included a phone number with the last 4 digits scratched out so hard the paper itself nearly split open. And what made those papers unsettling was not what they said, but how unlike Maria they seemed. Because she was reportedly obsessive about keeping things organized. She folded receipts neatly, stacked letters by date, even kept old wrapping paper inside labeled boxes. Yet during the final weeks before her death, the house had apparently become filled with half-destroyed reminders and unfinished thoughts. As though she no longer trusted certain things to remain written down. Her sister also claimed several framed photographs inside the hallway had been turned face down before the funeral. Not shattered. Not removed. Simply laid carefully against the table surface so the faces could no longer be seen. One picture reportedly showed Maria smiling beside relatives during a holiday years earlier. Another captured a birthday gathering inside the same house, now sitting in silence. And according to her sister, Maria had once told her she sometimes felt uncomfortable being watched by old photographs late at night, though nobody knows whether she meant that literally or emotionally. Maybe she simply could not bear memories anymore. Maybe grief and exhaustion had changed her relationship with familiar things. Nobody can say for certain. Then came the locked drawer in the bedroom. The only drawer in the entire house, her sister, reportedly, could not open immediately. And what disturbed her was not the lock itself, but the fact Maria had never hidden anything there before. Inside, according to later descriptions, were several small medicine containers without labels. No names, no instructions, just plain bottles with different numbers written in marker across the caps. Her sister admitted she had no idea what they were, or whether they were even important. But seeing them apparently reminded her of how Maria had started refusing to take medication in front of visitors during the final months, always slipping into another room first, before returning moments later, pretending nothing unusual had happened. And then there was the clock. An old silver bedside clock Maria reportedly inherited years earlier, the kind that made a soft ticking noise loud enough to hear during quiet nights. According to her sister, the clock had stopped at exactly 11:42, not because its batteries were dead, at least not according to one relative who later examined it, but simply frozen there without explanation, and for reasons she could not describe. Her sister claimed that time immediately brought back a memory of Maria standing near the back door weeks before her death, whispering something that nobody around her fully understood at the time. "If one day I disappear," Maria reportedly said while staring outside into the dark yard beyond the kitchen light. Don't believe everything people tell you afterward. And maybe that was the moment the story around Maria McCloy quietly changed, because until then, people had been searching for something dramatic, a hidden scandal, a dangerous secret, a shocking final event that could explain why the atmosphere around her last days felt so heavy. But according to her sister, the most horrifying truth was never about the way Maria died. It was about how long she had apparently been disappearing emotionally before anyone fully noticed it happening. Not disappearing in the literal sense, but slowly stepping away from the world piece by piece, while still smiling enough for photographs and answering enough phone calls to convince everyone she was fine. Her sister later admitted there were periods during the final year when Maria would vanish for 2 or 3 days at a time without clearly telling anyone where she had been. Then suddenly return home, carrying shopping bags she barely unpacked, speaking normally as if nothing unusual had happened. According to one former driver who occasionally worked for her, there were afternoons when Maria reportedly asked to be driven across town only to sit silently in the parked car for nearly an hour without going inside the destination. One time, she supposedly canceled a meeting at the last minute while already standing outside the building entrance. Another time, she reportedly changed routes 3 separate times because she believed too many familiar people might recognize her somewhere nearby. And what unsettled the driver most was not fear, but exhaustion. Because according to his later account, Maria often looked like someone trying very hard to appear emotionally present while carrying a weight nobody around her could actually see. A former co-worker also claimed Maria became increasingly difficult to reach during her final months. Not rude, never aggressive, just absent in strange ways. Messages read, but unanswered. Appointments quietly canceled less than 30 minutes before. They began promises to visit people she genuinely cared about that somehow never happened. And yet, whenever someone finally saw her in person again, she would reportedly apologize with such warmth and sincerity that nobody wanted to pressure her with questions. Even fans who occasionally met her in public later described something similar. They remembered her still smiling, still polite, still taking photographs. But several people quietly noticed how quickly she seemed to lose focus once. Conversations became longer than a few seconds, as if part of her attention remained fixed somewhere else the entire time. According to her sister, Maria had also begun leaving meals unfinished in ways that felt increasingly unnatural. Half-eaten soup left untouched for hours, bread drying out beside cold tea, forks placed carefully back onto plates after only 1 or 2 bites. And at first, relatives reportedly assumed stress or fatigue explained everything. But then it became impossible not to. Notice the pattern. Because Maria no longer seemed capable of sitting comfortably inside silence, televisions remained on even when she wasn't watching. Radios played softly in empty rooms, and during family visits, she allegedly tried delaying bedtime as long as possible by inventing small, unnecessary tasks around the house, wiping clean counters, reorganizing drawers, reheating drinks she never actually drank, until finally everyone else left, and she had no remaining excuse to avoid being alone again. One neighbor later claimed they often saw the light outside Maria's front door remain on until nearly sunrise. Not every night, but enough times to remember it afterward. And according to that same neighbor, there were evenings when Maria reportedly stood outside her own gate for unusually long periods before entering the house, handbag still hanging from her shoulder, keys already in her hand, simply staring toward the dark windows as traffic moved behind her in the distance. And that detail affected her sister more than any other. Because according to her, Maria once confessed something quietly while they were unloading groceries together. Something so ordinary at the time that it barely sounded alarming. "Sometimes," Maria reportedly whispered, without looking up, "I stay outside longer because the house feels different when nobody else is there." And years later, her sister now believes that sentence meant far more than anyone understood in the moment. Because, according to her final account, there were nights when Maria would arrive home, place her hand against the front door, and remain standing there silently for several minutes, as though she were trying to gather enough courage to walk into the empty house alone. By the time Maria's sister finally spoke again publicly about Maria McCloy, the tension that had surrounded the story no longer felt loud. It felt exhausted, like a house that had stayed awake too many nights in a row. And maybe that was why the most painful moment came without warning. Not during a dramatic confession, not during one of the stories about the strange final phone call, or the locked drawer, or the unfinished notes, but during something much smaller. According to people present, that evening, Maria's sister had been quietly sorting through old photographs at the dining table, while several relatives spoke softly in another room. And for a long time she reportedly said almost nothing at all. She only kept adjusting the corners of the pictures with her fingertips, as though afraid they might tear. One photograph apparently showed Maria years earlier sitting outside under weak afternoon sunlight with a cup balanced on her knee, smiling toward somebody outside the frame. Another captured her laughing while trying to hold down her scarf against strong wind near a parking lot. And according to her sister, what made the images unbearable was not sadness, but normality. Because looking back now, every photograph suddenly felt like evidence of moments everyone assumed would continue forever. At one point, her sister reportedly paused over a faded picture taken inside the same house where Maria spent her final months. And for several seconds, she simply stared at it, without blinking, the room around her growing quieter because people sensed something changing in her expression. Then she allegedly asked whether anyone remembered how much Maria used to hate sleeping with lights on when they were younger. Nobody answered immediately, and according to one relative, her sister smiled very faintly after asking the question. Not happily. More like somebody realizing too late that an important detail had been sitting directly in front of them the entire time. After that, the stories she told no longer sounded like explanations. They sounded like regrets. She recalled times Maria canceled dinner plans and claimed she was tired. Times she stopped replying to messages for entire weekends. Times she insisted she was fine so quickly that nobody dared continue asking questions. And perhaps what haunted her most was remembering how easily everyone accepted those answers, because Maria had apparently become very skilled at making loneliness look like privacy. According to her sister, there were evenings when Maria would sit beside other people for hours speaking normally, smiling at the right moments, asking polite questions, yet somehow still seeming emotionally unreachable in ways difficult to explain afterward. Like somebody standing behind glass no one else could see. Then her sister mentioned one particular afternoon that now reportedly replays in her head constantly. She had driven Maria home after a family visit, and before leaving, she noticed Maria remained standing beside the front door instead of going inside immediately, keys already in her hand, staring quietly at the entrance. According to her sister, she even joked at the time. "What are you waiting for? Someone to open it for you?" And Maria reportedly laughed softly before finally walking in without answering. For years, that moment meant absolutely nothing to her. But now she says it feels unbearable to remember, because she believes Maria may have already been, afraid of the silence waiting on the other side of that door. Then, finally, after speaking for nearly an hour without crying once, Maria's sister suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence while holding one of the photographs against her chest. According to people nearby, her breathing reportedly changed first. Small pauses between words, her voice tightening as if she were trying very hard to stay composed in front of strangers. And when she finally spoke again, the sentence came out, unfinished at first, almost swallowed halfway through. "I thought," she whispered quietly, "I thought Maria only wanted peace and quiet." Then silence. Long enough for someone in the room to lower the volume of the television in the next room without saying anything. Her sister looked down at the photograph again before continuing in a voice so soft, several people later disagreed about the exact wording. "I didn't know she was sinking." After saying that, she reportedly covered her mouth, briefly as though surprised the sentence had escaped at all. And for the first time since the funeral, she finally cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, no collapsing, no screaming, just a few quiet tears, while the room around her remained completely still. Somewhere deeper inside the house, an old ceiling fan continued turning slowly above an empty hallway, and nobody spoke for a very long time. After the interview ended, people reportedly stayed inside the house for a while without knowing exactly what to do next. Nobody argued. Nobody tried forcing more answers out of Maria's sister, because by then the atmosphere no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt more like standing inside the remains of conversations that had ended too late. One relative quietly gathered empty teacups from the table without speaking. Another folded several old blankets left untouched near the hallway chair where Maria McCloy used to sit during long evenings with the television running softly in the background. And, according to one person who stayed behind that night, Maria's sister spent several minutes alone near the kitchen sink, staring out through the dark window above it. Not crying anymore. Just standing there with both hands resting against the counter while the ceiling fan continued its slow, uneven rotation overhead. Eventually, someone switched off the television in the next room. And for a brief moment, the silence inside the house reportedly became so complete that even the faint ticking of the old stopped clock seemed almost possible to hear again. Outside, the neighborhood had already begun returning to itself the way neighborhoods always do after tragedy stops being new. A motorcycle passed loudly through the intersection near the corner store. Somewhere farther away, a group of teenagers laughed while crossing the street, carrying plastic bags filled with late-night food. The owner of a nearby fruit stand pulled a metal shutter halfway down before stopping to count money beneath a weak fluorescent light. And in one apartment across the road, somebody could reportedly be heard arguing about something completely ordinary through an open balcony door. Rent? Groceries? Maybe nothing important at all. Because the world surrounding Maria's old house had not paused long enough to fully understand what had happened inside it. According to neighbors, the lights there now remained off most nights, though from time to time people still glanced toward the kitchen window without fully realizing they were doing it. Not because they expected anything supernatural, but because certain places continue holding tension long after explanations run out. And perhaps that was what stayed with Maria's sister most after finally speaking publicly. Not a secret, not proof of anything hidden, but the unbearable possibility that someone can spend years quietly, drowning while still appearing functional enough for everybody else to believe they are simply tired. A few days later, according to one nearby resident, workers arrived briefly at the property to remove several remaining flower arrangements left over from the funeral. Dry petals scattered across the front steps, while traffic continued moving normally beyond the gate. One man carried away folded chairs that had been used during the memorial gathering. Another swept cigarette ash and dust from the sidewalk without looking up at the windows above him. And by evening, the house reportedly looked almost ordinary again. Curtains drawn, driveway empty, mailbox slightly crooked beneath fading paint. Near midnight, an elderly man inside a tiny watch repair shop several streets away slowly placed the final repaired watch of the evening onto a glass shelf before switching off the lamp above his counter. Outside, headlights continued sliding across the wet pavement in long, restless streaks of red and white, while somewhere beyond the traffic and closing storefronts, the dark house that once belonged to Maria remained completely still. And nobody could say for certain whether the things her sister finally revealed were the full truth.